Hello folks, I hope that you're having just a great and safe day today. Keep yourself safe in our modern COVID world. Today I want to take a look at the next sort of chapter in my Cthulhu Mythos, and today, which I'm dedicating to the month of October. But today I'm taking a break from my reviews and talk about a subject that I think has been a little actually controversial. And I'm going to make a claim that is actually a little different than I think most Cthulhu Mythos readers would do. And the question is, what is the first Cthulhu Mythos story? What do I consider to be the first authentic, genuine Cthulhu Mythos story? And there are basically three that I think you can choose. I'm going to go over those three, and then I'm going to tell you that's actually super secretly number 4, introduce that story, and then tell you why I think that story is actually the first Cthulhu Mythos story, super secretly. So, and then I'll make my argument therefore. So that's what this video is going to then take a look at. So first of all, let's start. What's the Cthulhu Mythos? Great question. The Cthulhu Mythos is a shared universe, and that part of the Cthulhu Mythos is going to be a key part of the definition of the mythos as we're exploring it. That was shared was created by H.P. Lovecraft. It was shared with him and other authors at that time, including Arthur, the guy who created Conan, Clark Ashton Smith, lots of other people, and lots of other people have written in this shared universe since then. It has a lot of elements that are shared from one story to the other, to the other, to the other, moving forward in time. And these are all key parts of what's happening. H.P. Lovecraft grew and developed as a writer, and he's very self-referential, and he also references other things too. So it's a shared universe. It's a horror universe. It has this basic core idea that nobody cares about you, nobody likes you, we're tiny, little, insignificant gnats in the greater scheme of things, and if the powers that be knew about us or cared about us, we'd be dead. And it's better for us not to know that, and not to know about them, or to bring ourselves to their attention. And so that's kind of the sort of the raison d'etre of the shared universe, the Cthulhu Mythos. So let's go ahead and start with the three stories that people typically think of when they think of the first story in the Cthulhu Mythos. And we'll be going back in these in reverse chronological order. So we're going to start with 1928's The Call of Cthulhu, around which the Cthulhu Mythos is in fact named. The Cthulhu Mythos introduces the character of Cthulhu. It's also, I would argue, the single most important story in the Cthulhu Mythos. There's a reason that most people who decide to try the Cthulhu Mythos will start with the Call of Cthulhu. It's a 10 out of 10 story, a 5 out of 5, a 4 out of 4, however many stars you're giving it, however many points you're giving it. It's a classic seminal horror work. In one story, H.P. Lovecraft pushed horror from beyond the tropes of werewolves, ghosts, little tiny vampires that were haunting people, possessions, that sort of thing, little small scale things, to a large, giant, planet-wide fear that's affecting the entire planet. It's this large-scale horror, and he pushes horror to the next level with this story, and it's incredibly well written, incredibly well done, and incredibly evocative too. And many people will look at the Call of Cthulhu as the first story, and the Call of Cthulhu is certainly, I would argue, the most influential story in the Cthulhu Mythos. It's the one that puts all the pieces together, that finally puts things. It's the thing that creates sort of the Cthulhu Mythos trends, traditions, and so forth. So it's certainly arguably the most important and influential story in the Cthulhu Mythos, but it's not the first story in the Cthulhu Mythos. And there are going to be others that we're taking a look at. Now, I would argue that it is like Sherlock Holmes in Detective Mythos. When Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes and his detective stories had already been written. They were already a genre. They already existed. But Sherlock Holmes created sort of the oeuvre, the genre of detective fiction, modernized it, brought everything together, and you could not write in a detective fiction work after the publication of Sherlock Holmes' stuff without knowing about and either writing for or writing against Sherlock Holmes. And in the same way, after the Call of Cthulhu was written, every Cthulhu Mythos horror story is going to be written in its shadow. It is the defining central genre creating work in the subgenre of horror of the Cthulhu Mythos. But it also is not the first, just like Sherlock Holmes is not the first detective fiction by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So the Call of Cthulhu is, to me, the Sherlock Holmes of its genre. But there are Cthulhu Mythos works that happened earlier. So now let's take a look at the next one, moving back in time. The next one's the Hound. All right, so the Hound introduces several elements that are going to be in the Cthulhu Mythos. It introduces the Necronomicon, which is the key core story book that's in a lot of these things. It introduces the Plateau of Ling, which is also a key place in the mythos. It also will introduce, it will also give a callback to mythos elements from a previous work. So there are two main reasons why people might argue that the Hound is the first mythos work. The first is that it's where some of the key elements first appear, mainly the Necronomicon. The Necronomicon appears. It's the key central book tenet text of the Cthulhu Mythos. It's one of the most important shared things, and this is where it appears. It's in the Hound. So the argument is that it's the place that has the Necronomicon. It's these, and introduces some of these other key elements of the Cthulhu Mythos. So the Hound, that's written in the early 20s, is in 22, if I remember correctly, is the first one, and that's one of the arguments in favor of the Hound. The other argument in favor of the Hound is that it actually, not only does it create a lot of new Cthulhu Mythos elements, but it also takes them from another story, which we'll look at next. And you can't have a mythos that's a shared universe until you get to the second story of that universe, the one that borrows elements from a previous story. And this is the one that borrows elements from a previous story. Therefore, this is the place where the Cthulhu Mythos actually begins, because it's where he's borrowing from itself. So that argument also sees the Hound as, yes, it's borrowing something from another story from 1921, which we'll look at next, but it also introduces some key elements to the mythos, namely the Necronomicon. So that is the arguments in favor of the Hound. The next story that the Hound borrows from is the Nameless City, set in Arabia. In the Nameless City, it introduces the character of the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazrad, and who will be later on, we'll find out in the Hound, he wrote the Necronomicon, and we'll learn more about him. We'll also be learning to the famous couplet about that which is dead, and so forth. This is going to be a key story. A two-line couplet, a poem from, which we'll find out later on, it's actually from the Necronomicon. It's a key element in both the Nameless City and in Call of Cthulhu. That's also built around this couplet where our main character, Cthulhu, it seems to be speaking of. So it's actually going to be this famous couplet from the book that we'll find out is actually from the book later on. But we'll be introduced to the guy who wrote the Necronomicon and this key couplet in the Nameless City. So the Nameless City then would obviously be where the Cthulhu Mythos begins, right? Nope, I don't think so. There are a lot of people out there who do, who either have the Nameless City or the Hound or the Call of Cthulhu as their starting stories for the mythos. But I think there's actually super secretly a story that was written before the City in 1920, and the City was written in 1921, and that story was written in 1920, and that is The Doom That Came to Sarnath. The Doom That Came to Sarnath is a 6-page short story. It's very short, very quick. And here's why I think The Doom That Came to Sarnath is the first Cthulhu Mythos story. It is a story which is set in a place called Manar. It introduces some storyline characters, the city of Sarnath, what Sarnath did to get the Doom, the entire story and description of what happens in the story. And that description is referred to in the Nameless City. The Nameless City itself refers to what happens in the Doom That Came to Sarnath. It is also self-referential in the sense that it brings these elements in. And so if you think that the Nameless City is a Cthulhu Mythos story, and it is, then you also have to include the Doom That Came to Sarnath as an earlier Cthulhu Mythos story. And thus the only way that you could argue that the Nameless City is the first mythos story is to use the same argument that some would use for the Hound that came later, and say that since it incorporated a previous story, The Doom That Came to Sarnath, it's the first Cthulhu Mythos story. I disagree with that logic. I actually think that's the first one, and so forth. The Doom That Came to Sarnath is not only roll called in that next story that we've already talked about, The Nameless City, it's actually roll called in At the Mountains of Madness, a key mythos work in the 30s, which is also a key mythos work. So we know that the events that happened in The Doom That Came to Sarnath happened in At the Mountains of Madness and in Nameless City, both of which are mythos stories. So if those two mythos stories are referring to The Doom That Came to Sarnath, The Doom That Came to Sarnath must be the first mythos story. So I believe, and I would argue, that The Doom That Came to Sarnath in 1920, very early on in Lovecraft's career, is the first Cthulhu Mythos story. But there you are. I actually give you 3 reviews of those in my next 3 reviews. I'll actually review Doom That Came to Sarnath in my next video, and then I'll review The Nameless City, and then I'll review The Hound for you, so you can get some of those 3 earlier Lovecraft works, and that'll actually finish up October for you, and then we'll move on to some other stuff that's not the Cthulhu Mythos. But there you are. Do you agree or disagree with my points about whether or not The Doom That Came to Sarnath is the first mythos story or not? I'm happy to engage you with that. What do you think it is? Do you think it's a different story? Not one of the 4 that I talked about? I'm happy to engage you with that in the comments below as well. If you enjoyed this video, please feel encouraged to hit that subscribe button. There's going to be so many more of these to follow. And finally, hey, I just want to take some time out of the video and thank you for taking some time out of your life and watching my video. We all have so many things happening in our lives, right? And we're being pulled in so many different directions. So the fact that you spent this time with me is incredibly humbling, and I really do appreciate it. So thanks again, and have a great day.